The day I finally moved into my new home was supposed to be one of the happiest milestones of my life, the moment where years of hard work, saving, and planning came together into something tangible I could walk through, touch, and proudly call mine. But what I didn't know at the time was that stepping into this neighborhood would also mean stepping into a bizarre power struggle with a woman who thought she owned not just her property, but the entire street itself. My house was a cozy two-story just outside the boundaries of a homeowners association, which had been one of the main reasons I chose it in the first place. I wanted the freedom to decide what color I could paint my door, how I could keep my yard, and the kind of holiday decorations I could put up without having to submit requests or deal with nitpicking committees. I had heard horror stories of HOA boards dictating absurd rules about mailbox shapes, acceptable plants, and even the length of grass, and I wasn't about to hand over control of my life after finally earning some independence. The realtor had reassured me over and over that while most of the neighborhood was under the control of the HOA, the stretch of land my house was on, 3 properties in total, had been legally exempt because the original developer never incorporated them into the community contract. That little detail was a blessing to me, but apparently it was going to be seen as some kind of unforgivable crime by one particular neighbor I would soon come to know all too well as Karen. The first few hours of the move were peaceful enough. My brother and a couple of friends helped me haul in furniture, boxes, and the kind of mismatched odds and ends you don't realize you've accumulated until you're dragging them into a new place. We laughed, sweated, and rewarded ourselves with pizza on the bare living room floor, making plans about how I'd arrange the space, and even joking about what kind of trouble I might get into with such newfound independence. Everything was lighthearted until the sound of sharp, rhythmic footsteps cut through the hum of our chatter, and standing in the doorway, without even knocking, was a woman in her late 50s, bleach blonde hair styled into a stiff bob, oversized sunglasses perched on her nose, even though the sun had already begun setting, and a scowl etched so deeply across her face it looked permanent. "Excuse me," she barked, her voice shrill and cutting in a way that made all of us pause mid-bite. "What exactly do you think you're doing here?" I blinked, not sure how to respond at first, because the question seemed ridiculous. Clearly, I was moving in. Uh, I just bought this house, I said cautiously, standing up and brushing off my jeans. "My name's Mark, I'm your new neighbor." Instead of the polite welcome I naively hoped for, she scoffed and crossed her arms. "Impossible. This house doesn't belong to you. This entire street is under the jurisdiction of the Willow Creek Homeowners Association, and as president of the HOA, it's my duty to make sure no unauthorized activity takes place." The way she said president made it sound like she believed she was the commander of a small nation rather than a suburban committee, and her posture, chin lifted, shoulders squared, only drove that delusion further. I tried to stay calm, reminding myself that maybe she was just confused. "Actually," I said evenly, "this property isn't part of the HOA. My realtor explained everything, and I signed the closing papers last week. It's exempt." That one word, exempt, seemed to ignite a fire behind her sunglasses. She yanked them off, revealing eyes that narrowed into slits, and snapped, "There is no such thing as exempt. We own this street, and if you live here, you follow our rules. That means no moving trucks after 6 p.m., no garbage left out overnight, no unapproved paint colors, and definitely no tacky lawn furniture." Her gaze flicked disdainfully toward the folding chairs we had set outside for breaks. My friends exchanged amused glances, clearly struggling not to laugh, but I could already sense the storm brewing. I reiterated, perhaps a bit more firmly, "With respect, you don't own this street. The county does. And again, this property isn't under the HOA. I've read the deeds, I've checked the maps. I'm not bound by your rules." For a moment, she looked like I had slapped her across the face, her mouth opening and closing without words forming, and then she hissed, "We'll see about that." With that, she turned on her heel and stomped back down the driveway, muttering something about calling an emergency board meeting. My brother broke the silence with a chuckle. "Congrats, man," he said, raising his soda can like a toast. "You've been here 3 hours and already met the neighborhood dragon." We all laughed, but a part of me couldn't shake the chill of her words. I had dealt with difficult people before, But there was something different about her, something territorial, entitled, and relentless. That night, as I lay on the floor mattress in my new bedroom, listening to the crickets outside, I told myself she couldn't actually do anything to me. After all, I wasn't the HOA. But deep down, I had a nagging feeling that this was only the beginning of a war I never asked for. The next morning, I woke up groggy from a restless night and was greeted not by the peaceful sound of birds or the excitement of starting a new chapter in my life, but by the shrill honking of a car horn outside my window, followed by the unmistakable voice of the same woman I had encountered the day before, yelling into a megaphone as if she were leading a protest. Pulling back the blinds, I saw her standing at the end of my driveway, dressed in a floral blouse that clashed horribly with the neon orange safety vest she had clearly put on to make herself look official, waving a clipboard around and demanding my attention while a handful of curious neighbors lingered across the street, whispering among themselves as though she had summoned them to witness my public shaming. "Attention, new resident," she bellowed, her voice amplified by the megaphone and carrying all the way down the block. "You are in violation of Willow Creek HOA regulations and must cease all unauthorized activity immediately. This includes unpermitted moving trucks, unregistered outdoor furniture, and non-approved landscaping modifications." I stumbled down the stairs and stepped outside, still in sweatpants and a t-shirt, my hair sticking up at odd angles, and the sight of me seemed to fuel her smugness as she raised her chin and declared, "I tried to warn you yesterday, but since you clearly didn't take me seriously, I have filed an official complaint, and you will be receiving fines in the mail shortly." That was the breaking point for me. My initial instinct had been to give her the benefit of the doubt, to assume this was just some kind of misunderstanding, but hearing her threaten me with fines, I couldn't possibly omit a spark of irritation in my chest, and I walked down the driveway to face her head on. "Listen," I said firmly, making sure my voice carried enough for the gathering audience to hear, "I am not part of your HOA. You don't have any jurisdiction over me or this property. If you try to send me fines, they'll go straight in the trash because, legally, you have no right to enforce anything here." Murmurs rippled through the neighbors, some clearly surprised, others hiding smirks behind their hands, and Karen's face turned a shade of red that clashed with her lipstick. "You arrogant little man," she spat, jabbing a finger toward my chest as though she could pierce me with her manicure alone. "This neighborhood has rules for a reason, and people like you think you can just waltz in here and ruin the harmony we've worked so hard to maintain. If you refuse to cooperate, then we'll escalate this matter. Don't think for a second that you can just ignore the Willow Creek HOA." I folded my arms, refusing to back down. "Go ahead," I said, keeping my tone calm but unyielding. "Call your board, call your lawyer, call whoever you want. The fact is, you don't own this house, you don't own this land, and you certainly don't own this street, no matter how many times you scream it into a megaphone." My words drew a few chuckles from the onlookers, and one older man actually clapped quietly before catching Karen's death glare and quickly shoving his hands into his pockets. She was clearly losing control of the situation, and that realization seemed to make her double down. "Fine," she screeched, slamming her clipboard shut, so hard it echoed, "Don't say I didn't warn you. By the end of this week, you will regret ever moving here." With that, she marched off, the megaphone swinging dangerously from her wrist, and the crowd slowly dispersed, leaving me standing there wondering just how far she was actually willing to take this vendetta. My friends, who had stayed the night after helping me unpack, came outside just in time to catch the tail end of the spectacle, and my buddy Eric whistled low. "Man, you weren't kidding about the dragon lady. She's on a whole other level." I tried to laugh it off, but deep down I was unsettled, not because I thought she had any real authority, but because people like her thrived on making life miserable in creative ways that didn't always involve laws or rules. Over the next few days, I started noticing little things that felt too coincidental to ignore. My garbage can mysteriously tipped over every morning, my mailbox stuffed with junk flyers clearly pulled from other people's driveways, and on one occasion a neon orange violation notice taped to my door with fine, $250, written in giant bold letters, even though there was no official seal or legal language attached, just Karen's scrawling handwriting signed with her overly elaborate signature. I took pictures of everything documenting each incident just in case. But the most infuriating part was the smug smile I'd catch on her face whenever I stepped outside, as if she were daring me to confront her again. One evening, as I was setting up my grill in the backyard to celebrate finally unboxing my kitchenware, she appeared at the fence line, her arms resting on the top rail like she had every right to monitor me. She said in that faux sweet tone people use when they're about to say something nasty, the HOA requires all fences to be painted white, not that tacky brown. You'll need to fix that immediately. I didn't even look up from the grill as I replied, "Not in my yard, Karen. This isn't HOA property." The sharp inhale she made was almost comical, like she couldn't believe I dared to use her name so casually, and she stomped away muttering about how rebels always learn the hard way. That phrase echoed in my mind later that night, and I couldn't help but wonder what exactly she meant. Would she try to rally other board members against me? Spread rumors to turn the neighbors hostile? Or was she brazen enough to try something more direct? Whatever it was, I knew one thing for certain. This wasn't going to end with a single shouting match. Karen had declared war, and as much as I didn't want to waste my new beginning battling an entitled HOA president, I wasn't about to roll over and let her trample on my rights either. If she wanted to fight, then she was going to find out that I could be just as stubborn as she was, maybe even more so. The next morning, I woke up groggy from a restless night and was greeted not by the peaceful sound of birds or the excitement of starting a new chapter in my life, but by the shrill honking of a car horn outside my window, followed by the unmistakable voice of the same woman I had encountered the day before, yelling into a megaphone as if she were leading a protest. Pulling back the blinds, I saw her standing at the end of my driveway, dressed in a floral blouse that clashed horribly with the neon orange safety vest she had clearly put on to make herself look official, waving a clipboard around and demanding my attention while a handful of curious neighbors lingered across the street, whispering among themselves as though she had summoned them to witness my public shaming. "Attention, new residents," she bellowed, her voice amplified by the megaphone and carrying all the way down the block. "You are in violation of Willow Creek HOA regulations and must cease all unauthorized activity immediately. This includes unpermitted moving trucks, unregistered outdoor furniture, and non-approved landscaping modifications." I stumbled down the stairs and stepped outside, still in sweatpants and a t-shirt, my hair sticking up at odd angles, and the sight of me seemed to fuel her smugness as she raised her chin and declared, "I tried to warn you yesterday, but since you clearly didn't take me seriously, I have filed an official complaint and you will be receiving fines in the mail shortly." That was the breaking point for me. My initial instinct had been to give her the benefit of the doubt, to assume this was just some kind of misunderstanding, but hearing her threaten me with fines, I couldn't possibly elicit a spark of irritation in my chest, and I walked down the driveway to face her head on. "Listen," I said firmly, making sure my voice carried enough for the gathering audience to hear. "I am not part of your HOA. You don't have any jurisdiction over me or this property. If you try to send me fines, they'll go straight in the trash, because legally, you have no right to enforce anything here." Murmurs rippled through the neighbors, some clearly surprised, others hiding smirks behind their hands, and Karen's face turned a shade of red that clashed with her lipstick. "You arrogant little man," she spat, jabbing a finger toward my chest as though she could pierce me with her manicure alone. "This neighborhood has rules for a reason, and people like you think you can just waltz in here and ruin the harmony we've worked so hard to maintain. If you refuse to cooperate, then we'll escalate this matter. Don't think for a second that you can just ignore the Willow Creek HOA." I folded my arms, refusing to back down. "Go ahead," I said, keeping my tone calm but unyielding. "Call your board, call your lawyer, call whoever you want. The fact is, you don't own this house, you don't own this land, and you certainly don't own this street, no matter how many times you scream it into a megaphone." My words drew a few chuckles from the onlookers, and one older man actually clapped quietly before catching Karen's death glare and quickly shoving his hands into his pockets. She was clearly losing control of the situation, and that realization seemed to make her double down. "Fine," she screeched, slamming her clipboard shut so hard it echoed. "Don't say I didn't warn you. By the end of this week, you'll regret ever moving here." With that, she marched off, the megaphone swinging dangerously from her wrist, and the crowd slowly dispersed, leaving me standing there wondering just how far she was actually willing to take this vendetta. My friends, who had stayed the night after helping me unpack, came outside just in time to catch the tail end of the spectacle, and my buddy Eric whistled low. "Man, you weren't kidding about the dragon lady. She's on a whole other level." I tried to laugh it off, but deep down I was unsettled, not because I thought she had any real authority, but because people like her thrived on making life miserable in creative ways that didn't always involve laws or rules. Over the next few days, I started noticing little things that felt too coincidental to ignore. My garbage can mysteriously tipped over every morning, my mailbox stuffed with junk flyers clearly pulled from other people's driveways, and on one occasion a neon orange violation notice taped to my door with fine $250 written in giant bold letters, even though there was no official seal or legal language attached, just Karen's scrawling handwriting signed with her overly elaborate signature. I took pictures of everything, documenting each incident just in case, but the most infuriating part was the smug smile I'd catch on her face whenever I stepped outside, as if she were daring me to confront her again. One evening, as I was setting up my grill in the backyard to celebrate finally unboxing my kitchenware, she appeared at the fence line, her arms resting on the top rail like she had every right to monitor me. You know, she said in that faux sweet tone people use when they're about to say something nasty, by the time the second week rolled around, it became glaringly obvious that Karen had managed to mobilize her fellow HOA board members into some sort of neighborhood militia because I started receiving a barrage of letters, all delivered by hand instead of through the mail, printed on cheap paper with the Willow Creek HOA logo slapped at the top, claiming I owed thousands of dollars in fines for violations ranging from failure to seek approval for residency to noncompliance with neighborhood harmony standards, which wasn't even a real thing. But the sheer audacity of these documents was almost impressive in a twisted way, because they were formatted to look as official as possible, complete with faux legal language and empty threats about liens and foreclosure, as if they thought I wouldn't know any better. The thing was, I did know better. I had triple-checked my deed, I had spoken to my realtor again just to be sure, and I had even visited the county clerk's office to verify that my parcel of land was not, and never had been, under HOA jurisdiction, which meant all their paperwork was nothing more than glorified harassment. But Karen didn't care about legality, she cared about power, and her strategy became clear. Flood me with so much nonsense, so many scare tactics, that I'd eventually cave in just to get her off my back. What she hadn't accounted for, though, was that I wasn't alone in this anymore. By then, several neighbors had started quietly showing their support, dropping by to tell me they thought Karen was out of line, that she'd been pulling similar stunts for years, but never had someone push back, quite like I was. One older gentleman named Mr. Hernandez even confided that Karen once tried to fine him for having a basketball hoop in his driveway, even though his grandson only played with it on weekends. He fought it for months, finally gave in and removed it, and you could see the regret in his eyes as he warned me not to underestimate her persistence. Their sympathy strengthened my resolve. If Karen thought she could bully me into submission, she was in for a rude awakening. Still, her tactics grew more theatrical as days passed. One morning, I opened my door to find a neon orange poster duct taped across it in massive block letters. Non-compliant resident, beware. It felt like something out of a dystopian novel, the kind of public shaming meant to turn neighbors against me, except instead of uniting the block against me, it had the opposite effect. More and more people started shaking their heads at her antics, and some even came by to apologize on behalf of the neighborhood, embarrassed by her behavior. That only seemed to enrage her further, and the more resistance she met, the more extreme her claims became. She started telling anyone who would listen that my presence was driving down property values, that my house was going to track crime because I didn't follow their safety standards, and at one point, she even had the gall to claim that by not joining the HOA, I was freeloading off their amenities and services. That part made me laugh out loud, because I had no interest in their community pool, their tennis courts, or their meticulously micromanaged landscaping budget. If anything, I was glad I wasn't paying into the black hole of fees she seemed to relish controlling. But laughter aside, her campaign of intimidation was wearing on me. Every time I pulled into my driveway, I half expected to find another fake violation notice or some petty act of sabotage, like the time she called the towing company on my perfectly legal guest car and tried to argue with the driver when he refused to take it, or the time she stood at the edge of my lawn for half an hour with a tape measure, muttering about encroachment as though she were a government surveyor. I realized then that this wasn't just about harassment anymore. Karen was trying to build a case, even if it was fabricated, to pressure me into court or force me out altogether. So I decided to fight fire with fire. I scheduled a meeting with the county sheriff's office, bringing along my folder of evidence, photos of Karen trespassing, videos from my new security cameras showing her planting fake notices, copies of every absurd letter she'd handed me, and the deputy I spoke to was both amused and appalled. He explained that while HOAs could govern properties under their contracts, they had zero authority over homes outside of them, which meant Karen's attempts to enforce anything on me weren't just invalid, they were legally considered harassment. He assured me that if she crossed the line again, I could file an official complaint, and he even gave me his direct number in case things escalated. Armed with that knowledge, I felt more confident than ever. But I also knew Karen wouldn't go down quietly. Sure enough, a few days later, she showed up at my door with two men in tow, both dressed in business casual attire, clutching briefcases like they were about to walk into a courtroom. "This is your final warning," she declared loudly, making sure the neighbors across the street could hear. "These are our HOA attorneys, and they're prepared to issue a lien against your property if you don't pay your outstanding fines." I almost laughed, but instead, I calmly pulled out my phone, started recording, and asked for their bar numbers and identification. The two men shifted uncomfortably, exchanged glances, and then stammered something about paperwork being in process, which only confirmed what I already suspected. They weren't lawyers at all, just friends of Karen's playing dress up in a last-ditch effort to scare me. "Great," I said, evenly still recording, because I'll be forwarding this to the sheriff along with a harassment complaint. "You just made my case even stronger." Karen's face drained of color as the men mumbled excuses and hurried away, leaving her alone on my porch, sputtering with rage. But for the first time, I saw something flicker in her eyes that I hadn't before: doubt. She realized then that her bluffs weren't working, that I wasn't some naive pushover. And though I knew she wasn't done, not by a long shot, it felt like the first crack in the armor of her self-appointed reign over the neighborhood. It was a Saturday afternoon when Karen decided to escalate from fake lawyers and phony notices to something she probably thought was her ultimate weapon: law enforcement. And while I was in my driveway washing my car, enjoying the rare peace of a sunny weekend, I suddenly noticed flashing red and blue lights reflecting off the water droplets on the hood, followed by the low rumble of a police cruiser pulling up right in front of my house. My stomach clenched, not because I thought I had done anything wrong, but because I knew exactly who was behind this, and sure enough, the second the officer stepped out, Karen came marching down the sidewalk like she had summoned him personally, waving her hands dramatically and pointing straight at me as though she had caught me committing a felony. "That's him," she shouted before the officer could even approach. "That's the non-compliant resident who refuses to follow our rules. He's endangering the neighborhood. He's trespassing on HOA property, and I demand you remove him immediately." The officer, to his credit, didn't take her word at face value. He adjusted his sunglasses, looked at me, then back at her, and asked in a calm, professional tone, "Ma'am, is this his house?" Karen puffed up her chest, clearly eager to make her case, and declared, "The street belongs to the HOA, and anyone who lives on it must abide by our regulations. He has no right to be here unless he submits to our authority, and he's already racked up thousands of dollars in unpaid fines." The officer raised an eyebrow, then turned to me. "Sir, do you have proof of ownership for this property?" Without hesitation, I pulled out my phone, opened the digital copy of my deed I had saved precisely for this kind of scenario, and handed it over. "Yes, officer," I said calmly, "this house belongs to me. And more importantly, it's not part of the HOA." I've verified that with the county clerk, and I have documentation showing that this property was never incorporated into their association. The officer studied the document, nodded, and handed my phone back. Then he turned to Karen. Ma'am, this is outside your jurisdiction. He's not in your HOA. Karen's face twisted into a mask of outrage, her voice climbing in pitch as she sputtered, That's impossible. The entire street is ours. We maintain it, we manage it, we enforce it. The officer shook his head patiently. Actually, county records show that the street is public property maintained by the county, not your HOA, which means you don't own it, and you certainly don't have authority over his home. The silence that followed was glorious, broken only by Karen's incoherent mumbling as she tried to argue, her hands flapping in wild gestures that only made her look more unhinged. But he's destroying the harmony. He's lowering property values. He has unapproved furniture. The officer sighed, clearly done with her theatrics, and said firmly, Ma'am, none of that is illegal. Unless you have a valid complaint that involves a law being broken, this is not a police matter. He glanced at me then, almost apologetically, and added, Sorry to bother you, sir. It looks like you're dealing with a civil dispute that doesn't involve us. If she continues to harass you, though, I recommend filing a report. Karen's mouth fell open, and for once she had no comeback, no clever retort, just a strangled noise of disbelief as the officer returned to his cruiser. But she wasn't finished, not yet. As soon as he drove off, she marched right up to me, her face inches from mine, and hissed, You think you've won? You think one cop's opinion changes anything? You're a cancer in this neighborhood, and I'll root you out if it's the last thing I do. I stared at her for a long moment, my patience finally snapping, and replied coldly, Karen, you don't scare me. You can call the cops, you can send fake lawyers, you can plaster my door with your garbage notices, but at the end of the day, the law isn't on your side. And the more you push, the more evidence I collect. Keep this up, and it's not me who'll be answering to the authorities, it's you. For the first time, I saw something flicker across her face that looked almost like fear, quickly masked by anger, but I could tell the reality was sinking in. Her threats weren't working anymore. Still, I knew better than to assume it was over. People like Karen didn't quit. They doubled down, they schemed, they clawed for any shred of control they could salvage, and sure enough, the very next day, she gathered a group of HOA board members outside my house, staging what I could only describe as a picket line, complete with signs that read Protect Our Neighborhood and Stop the Outsider. Neighbors peeked out from behind curtains, some clearly embarrassed, others intrigued. But the entire spectacle only made the board look ridiculous, chanting half-hearted slogans while Karen barked into a megaphone about dangerous precedents and non-compliant invaders. I stood on my porch, arms crossed, recording the whole thing because at this point, I had decided the best weapon against her wasn't just ignoring her. It was exposing her, documenting every tantrum, every fraudulent claim, and building the airtight case that would eventually shut her down for good. And as I watched her parade around with her little entourage, I realized something important. She wasn't just fighting me anymore. She was fighting reality, the law, and the growing tide of neighbors who were starting to see through her facade. The standoff with Karen reached its breaking point a week later when her desperation transformed from petty harassment into an all-out attempt to seize control of the situation by brute force. And though I had been expecting another stunt, I still wasn't prepared for the sheer scale of what she unleashed. It started on a bright Monday morning when I noticed several large notice of foreclosure signs staked into my front lawn, printed on glossy poster board with the Willow Creek HOA logo. Stamped across the top and nailed to the wooden post by my mailbox was a huge laminated sheet declaring that my property was being repossessed by order of the HOA board. For a split second, my heart lurched in panic. Foreclosure was a terrifying word, after all. But as soon as I scanned the ridiculous document, filled with typos and vague legal jargon like noncompliance of rules pertaining to house harmony, my fear turned into outright laughter. This was Karen's grand finale, a sham foreclosure designed to scare me into surrender. Unfortunately for her, it backfired spectacularly because as I was ripping one of the signs out of the ground, a pair of county sheriff deputies pulled up clearly responding to the complaint I had filed the week before with all my collected evidence, and Karen, who had been standing smugly across the street with her arms folded, suddenly went pale when she saw the uniforms step out of the cruiser. "Sir, ma'am," one deputy said professionally, "we've received reports of ongoing harassment and false claims of authority by the Willow Creek HOA against this property. We're here to settle this once and for all." I wasted no time handing over the thick folder I had compiled, now bursting with photos, letters, and videos. Proof of every violation notice, every fake lawyer stunt, every time Karen trespassed on my property, and as the deputies flipped through the evidence, their brows furrowed deeper with each page. Finally, one turned to Karen, his voice firm. "Ma'am, you have no authority over this property. This home is not part of your HOA, and your repeated attempts to enforce rules here amount to harassment. If this behavior continues, you could be facing civil penalties and even criminal charges." Karen stammered, her face blotchy red as she sputtered. But the street. We own the street. He doesn't belong here. He's ruining everything." The deputy cut her off. "No, ma'am. The street is public property. You do not own it. The county does. And unless this gentleman is breaking an actual law, you have no grounds to involve law enforcement." The second deputy stepped closer, lowering his voice in a way that carried more weight than shouting ever could. "This is your last warning. Any further harassment, false documentation, or attempts to impersonate legal authority will result in charges. Do you understand?" For a moment, Karen looked like she might explode, her mouth opening and closing as if she were searching for some last desperate argument. But all that came out was a strangled, "This isn't over." Before she spun on her heel and stormed back toward her house, the two deputies watching her go with barely concealed exasperation. When they turned back to me, I expected some kind of lecture to keep the peace, but instead, one of them chuckled and said, "Don't worry about her. People like that usually burn themselves out when they realize the law isn't on their side." They left shortly after, and for the first time since moving in, I felt a genuine wave of relief wash over me. The nightmare wasn't completely over. I knew Karen well enough to expect the occasional dirty look or muttered insult, but her reign of terror had been broken in front of the entire neighborhood, and everyone had seen her authority dismantled piece by piece. Over the following weeks, the atmosphere shifted noticeably. Neighbors who had once avoided eye contact began stopping by to chat, some offering baked goods as peace offerings, others simply thanking me for standing up to her because they had been too intimidated to do so themselves. Even the board members who had once followed her around like loyal puppies started distancing themselves, no longer attending her impromptu rallies or echoing her endless complaints. I had become something of an accidental folk hero, the guy who stood up to the HOA president, and won, though I never asked for the title. What I wanted was peace, and slowly but surely that's what I got. Karen, meanwhile, seemed to retreat into her house, her once daily patrols dwindling until weeks would pass without me seeing her at all. Rumor had it she was facing internal backlash from within the HOA itself. Several board members supposedly demanded her resignation after realizing how much legal risk she had exposed them to, and though I never confirmed the details, I couldn't help but smile at the thought of her empire crumbling. One evening, as I sat on my porch sipping a cold drink, I caught sight of her across the street, standing in her yard, glaring at me with a mixture of hatred and defeat. For the first time, I didn't feel anger toward her, just pity. She had built her entire identity around controlling others, and now that her power had been stripped away, she was left with nothing but bitterness. I raised my glass slightly in a mock toast, and though her scowl deepened, she turned away without a word. In that moment, I knew the battle was truly over. I had moved into my new home expecting nothing more than a fresh start and a bit of independence, but instead, I'd been thrust into a war with a woman who thought she owned the world around her. In the end, though, the law, common sense, and a little persistence had won. My house was mine, my freedom intact, and no amount of HOA bluster could change that. And if Karen or anyone else ever tried again, I was more than ready to stand my ground.